Howdy folks, my name is Brian Ellis. I'm a recent graduate of the University of Texas at Austin, and today we're going to be diving into musical interfaces for non-musicians and how those can help distribute musical agency as well as lower the barrier of entry to music making. So, gonna read through the abstract really quick, bear with me. Musical agency is essentially a measure of control over a piece of music. In electronic fixed media works, the composer has almost total agency or control over the work as it's played back exactly the same way every time. In Cage's 433, he divests agency away from himself to the environment or to the audience to allow the noises like HVAC sounds and everything to fill up the musical content of the work. Just as Cage designed a way for the environment to have a say in the musical conversation, so too do many composers today design interfaces so that way others can have this same expressive, meaningful musical input. In many cases, these interfaces are designed for non-musicians, meaning that anyone, regardless of previous training, can quickly approach the interface, learn how to express themselves with it musically. These interfaces allow dancers, cooks, drivers, in some cases just anyone with a cell phone to be able to participate in this musical experience that they had previously been excluded from. So throughout the rest of this talk, we're just going to be diving into this concept of musical agency, interfaces, and then going into a bunch of examples so that way you can leave hopefully inspired about some of this interesting work that is going on and motivated to go make some of your own. So, going over the agenda really quick, first thing we're going to talk about is musical agency, and then we're going to talk about some historical interface examples. Then we're going to see what the general technological trends are, and then how the different kinds of agents fit into the trends that are set up. And then we'll go through a whole bunch of examples. Alrighty, so agency, just on its own, is a self-belief in capacity to engage and intentionally influence one's life circumstances. So to that end, we're going to extend this to say musical agency is a self-belief in a capacity to engage, initiate, and intentionally influence one's musical circumstances. So to get a better understanding of what this actually means in practice, we're going to look at definition through examples. If we were to look at a composer such as Beethoven, who we will use as a stand-in for most Western classical music, we would see that he keeps a good deal of agency for himself. He decides exactly which pitches you should be playing at which time, how long they should be, things like that. But a lot of the more minute details of specific accents and phrasings and how a particular piece should sit or feel or, the emotion, he leaves up to the performers to decide in their own individual interpretations of his music. If we were to compare this against someone like Pierre Boulez or the total serialists, right, we would see there is much less agency that is given away there by the composers. When every single note has an articulation and a dynamic tied to it, it takes away a lot of that expressive power that performers had previously had. If we were to take this to the extreme, we would see the paradigm of recording technologies that we see today, epitomized by Taylor Swift or Beyonce, where you have every single millisecond of a sound file is very meticulously crafted such that it is played back exactly the same way every single time. And the performer is cut out of this loop. They no longer have agency in this paradigm, whereas the composers or the sound designers have all of the creative control. If we were to compare this trend of concentrating agency to the opposite, we would look at composers who intentionally divest their musical agency. The first things that come to mind would be the traditions of, say, jazz or bluegrass, where we have intentional improvisations, where there are long sections of the song where the composer says, write a solo here, play something fun and interesting that is engaging with what everyone else is expecting. And in doing so, the composer is giving this musical choice to the performer to fill that space with whatever they would like. If we were to look at another composer, we might find someone like Hildegard Westerkamp, who championed sound walking. In such pieces, the listener is encouraged to go wander around their local cityscape or landscape and hear and see the musical material that is presented to them through walking. In such a piece, the actual musical content is entirely up for the environment to decide, but Hildegard still has a good degree of agency as she determines the form. Do you start over here, walk over there, and walk back? Is it ABA in that sense? Or a number of other things where she can exert some sort of musical agency over the work to still sculpt the piece and such that it is a meaningful musical experience that is just filled with the sounds of the environment. With these couple of examples of divesting musical agency, the general question arises, well, what is a general way to do this? And the answer is by designing interfaces through which agents other than the composer can act. So, unpacking this a little bit, an interface is a system, either physical or conceptual, with inputs, outputs, and optional processing. And an agent is an entity that perceives and acts. If we were to look at a couple of examples of agents and interfaces, we would find an old work that we can look at, one by Mozart. This is the score of Mozart's Dice Games, in which Mozart has given some amount of compositional agency to randomness, to dice, to the environment. And in doing so, he allows any fool who is able to throw dice to compose their own musical composition. Now, if you listen to a lot of these, you will find that they all are in C major. They all modulate about halfway through. They all are in 3/4, and they all, end with a nice, perfect, authentic cadence. The interface Mozart has designed in this case is this chart with numbers, and you throw dice, and the actor in this case is the dice or the randomness itself, and the composer is able to exert his compositional influence into making sure that it's always the same length, it's always in C major, but he's able to allow the dice to determine what exact notes will be played at any given time. Another example of one of these musical interfaces is John Cage's 433, where he simply opens the door and frames the time period in which the piece is taking place as an opportunity for any environmental or audience member sounds to exist as the content of the piece itself. So, however, both of those pieces do not really engage with a lot of music technology, and we can do much better today. So if we look at some of the general trends in music technology, we'll see you have things like microphones and mixers and equalizers and effects and ambisonics and all this stuff, and especially the digital audio workstation work towards giving the composer total control over the sound file they produce. The idea of a digital audio workstation is to really give that composer that absolute control over every minute detail of the sound file that is getting distributed to the world, so that way it is always reproduced exactly the same way, exactly as the composer would like it to come through, cutting the performer entirely out of the loop. So in doing so, most of this musical technology is towards the end of concentrating musical agency. So the question is, of course, what are the counterexamples? And so these counterexamples, like I've alluded to before, are interfaces for others to act through when the piece of music is being realized. So let's look at Steve Parker's Sound Atlas as an example of one of these novel interfaces. Here's a picture of what it looks like. Very briefly, a description of what is happening here. This is a road in Austin, Texas, that someone is able to drive through, and as they enter or exit different regions, different sounds start or stop playing. In this case, the interface of Google Maps is allowing the agent of whoever happens to be driving on this road to execute the musical performance themselves. This is no longer a static audio file that gets sent out to the world. This is something that has to be realized, has to be performed, and it is performed by an untrained person who simply has the iPhone with the app installed to be able to listen to it as they drive down this road. Another example of a technological interface for a non-composer to act through would be the one displayed in Dan Crawford's A Song of Our Warming Planet. It's a string quartet where the environment is given a role to play in choosing the notes that each individual string player plays. Essentially, the temperature in different hemispheres over different lengths of historical time are mapped to pitches on the staff, and as the temperature rises with global warming, you hear the pitches rise as well as time progresses. Now, this is an interesting piece because every year has the opportunity to be updated with the newest climate data and have that be translated to a new piece that is slightly longer than before. So in this way, the environment is really acting and changing the contents of the piece as it progresses. Another example of a technological interface designed to distribute musical agency away from the composer would be George Lewis's interactive trio. In this piece, the interface that is being utilized is actually the auditory interface between two performers who are improvising together. If you were to be two performers standing next to each other improvising, each performer would individually listen. That would be their input to what the other person is playing. They would think about what they would like to do, how they would like to respond, and then they would play something back as their output. This interface is what is utilized in the piece, as George Lewis has designed an AI that has a microphone as input to listen to the trombone and the piano. It then thinks and processes what it would like to do, and then it plays that back on the piano. And so in this case, it is utilizing an interface for a trained musician to be able to act and engage with. So in these three examples, we saw three different categories of agents who the interfaces were designed for. We saw passive agents, such as the environment. We saw these active agents, such as the driver in the car and a trained musical performer. And those active agents were either trained, such as a musical improviser, or they were cross-trained. They were good at something else, and that was being utilized or exploited towards a musical end. So a passive agent would be something like the environment or the dice or computers, in the case where they are just generating random numbers. In these cases, such as with the dice games or the Song of Our Warming Planet, we find that the composer still maintains a lot of compositional agency. Mozart's piece is always in C major. Dan Crawford's piece will always start the same way with the first 100 years, as those will not retroactively change. In these cases, the composers really know what's going to happen, and they can account for a lot of these changes, as the agents they're designing for are passive. They're not going to come, sit down in the rehearsal studio with you and throw you something new and challenge your ideas. They're just going to exist and can be utilized over and over again for your compositional process. This is in contrast to our active agents, or our active trained agents. So our active trained agents are going to be those who are trained in using the interface. These are generally musical performers. I would go so far as to say sheet music is an example of an interface designed for an active trained agent. The sheet music is the interface that the composer uses to tell the performer what they would like done. And the trained agent needs a lot of training in how to play the violin or how to play the piano or whatever it may be in order to properly interpret the sheet music and perform it. In these cases, composers have the choice generally of how much agency they would like to divest. If you think, Pierre Boulez gives less agency than Beethoven, and Beethoven gives less agency to his performers than, say, Bill Monroe or someone who writes bluegrass. In these cases, it's, obviously musicians have agendas and things they would like to do, and so it is very different from that paradigm of composing for the environment or for dice, where you can predict all of the different outcomes, and you instead, as a composer, need to contend with, what the active trained agent or musician is going to want to do. So this last category is interesting because it kind of combines the best of both parts. These cross-trained agents are agents who are really trained at something else. In all of the examples we're going to see after that, these are dancers, they are drivers, they are readers, they're anyone who can, run and exercise. And in these cases, the composer still maintains some compositional agency, as they can define what inputs are valid, just as Mozart can define, well, we're going to use 2 dice, and if you're using 3 dice, you're wrong, and we don't account for that, and, the table only goes so far. We don't have those additional options. And so the composer can still define the possibility space of what might happen, but they can't define what the human on the other end is going to want to do with it. So, a couple of these examples. The first we're going to look at is Courtney Brown's interactive tango milonga. For this work, Courtney Brown made electronics that can clip onto the ankles of the performers that interface with software running on a nearby laptop that then controls the music that is being performed. So in this case, the tango dancers actually drive the music that is happening rather than the other way around. She can put these ankle-based electronics on any tango dancer, who can then come in and very quickly begin to understand and drive the musical direction. So another example of an interface designed for a non-musician would be a piece like Steve Parker's News Noise. This is one of these stopwatch pieces where everyone is given a sheet of instructions and what time to do each of these instructions. And in doing so, the composer gives each individual the opportunity to say, oh, well, rubbing the newspaper here, I think this needs to be a very, violent, aggressive rubbing sound, or, the mood is quiet, we're soft, it needs to be a softer, gentler rubbing sound. This way, anyone who knows how to crinkle newspaper or eat Pop Rocks is able to have the same valid musical experience when performing Steve Parker's work that most audience members do not have a chance to partake in. So another example of this is Toshis' Ear Talk. This piece was going to be presented at SEAMUS as well, so if you have the ability to go look it up and watch it, I highly encourage you to go look at it. For the piece, all of the participants spend 24 hours leading up to the event going around and collecting sounds from their area using the Voice Memos app on their iPhone. They then upload it to a Google Drive folder where Toshi takes it and puts it on a canvas that is then played back continuously. The participants then, during the performance of the music, are able to type comments into YouTube and move around where samples are relative to each other, both in time and in intensity. So you could say, oh, well, make sample 9 softer, and it would lower the volume of sample 9 in the context of the work. This way, anyone who has the ability to just type into comments on YouTube is able to control how these sounds are being realized. Another example of a performer designing an interface for a non-musician is Shelley Nuts' Project Group. In this piece, she has a live video chat going with a projection artist and a dancer. Both the projection artist and the dancer are able to feed data back to Shelley Nuts' computer that is able to process the information provided and use that to influence the sound. This data can be anything from the position of the dancer's hands to the various colors being used in the projection art, and that can be used to map to various different parameters of the music that is being produced. In this way, she allows these non-musicians to have this very valid and real-time feedback of their actions moving and triggering different sounds and ideas in the music that is happening. Another piece that sits in this vein is Monty Taylor's Femskaya. This is a piece that is actually designed for a Foley artist. The way it works is any individual who would like to present the piece is given a set of audio files that they are to recreate with their mouth or with noises in however they can to imitate the original samples provided. When the sound files are then processed by the electronics that he provides and played out as a real-time piece, the result is a performance that is both highly unique to the individual who assembled the sound files, as well as, highly tailored by the composer to fit and feel exactly as he wants it to, because he knows the kinds of things the performer will generally be doing. This piece is really interesting. It's by Douglas Laustein. It's called Wires, and it is a choose-your-own-adventure sound installation. The way it works is there are a series of books, and each book has a short couple of paragraphs that form a choose-your-own-adventure. And when you open the book, these electronics where you start a sound playing. At the end of the couple of paragraphs, there are options depending on what part of the story you want to happen next, where then you choose the next book to open and you start the sound file. And by the end of the story, these different sound files add up into a collective drone sound space that is highly unique to the person who was reading and making the decisions, as each of these decisions contributed to a specific piece of sound that then exists inside the loops that are playing back as they finish the story. Anyone who is able to read a choose-your-own-adventure book is able to design the sound space of the piece as they go on. So another piece that is aimed at a general interest audience is Miki Delp's Gemini 6B. This is another audio installation where each of these consoles that you see around this main unit are each individually musical instruments that are designed to be played by someone who has never seen it before and is able to just walk up, press buttons, or pull the joysticks and immediately start seeing what is happening to the music around them. Miki Delp has talked pretty extensively about his research process and the iterations that led to this final result. And one of the things that really stuck out to me is how much work he puts into making sure that these are as universal as possible and do not actually require knowledge of how electronic instruments work in order to be able to utilize them. Now, all of the examples so far were individual artists who were exploring their own, sonic truths in trying to design all of these different musical interfaces. The next couple of examples I want to dive into are examples from industry. These are companies who are working to make interactive musical experiences for lay people who do not necessarily have any musical training. So the first of these is Echoes, and they do immersive sound walks. So similar to the Steve Parker work, this is a productionized version where a client is able to upload a variety of different audio files and where they want them to be triggered, and then any user can listen to this immersive sound walk as they travel around the city. Another example is Muse. These are designed and marketed as meditation headbands, although they've been very quickly adopted by several in the new music community to allow for interactive musical displays that are sonifications of what is happening in a participant's mind. So in such pieces, you would put on the headset and you would begin meditating, and the relative success that you have in trying to quiet your mind could determine what noises were being played in the sonic space. So in this way, anyone who is skilled at meditating would be able to control the scope of the work and have it flow and ebb according to their own, artistic agency that they want to exhibit, rather than being beholden to a composer making those decisions for them. The last example that I want to highlight for today is Weave. This is a running app that is able to do variable speed live renditions of songs. Let's say you start off running kind of slowly. It would play you a slower rendition of a song to match the speed at which you're running. And as you speed up, the song that you're hearing would change. Now, it's interesting to notice that this isn't just a beat matching thing where they just take the same track and play it faster or slower. They are actually swapping out different tracks that sound better at different tempos. So in a slower vibe, you might get a more laid back, expressive performance. But when you were really running quickly, it would be playing a very upbeat song that would have more electronica vibes or would be more energizing to help you try to maintain that faster rate at which you're running. Now you can imagine anyone who is able to run would then be able to express themselves using this software. You could make your own rendition of the songs on the platforms by choosing when to go faster or slower, by controlling for yourself the rubato of a certain part of the piece. It would now be within the control of someone who can just run, not someone who has a long musical pedigree and knows what rubato means. So tying all these threads together, these were all examples of cross-trained agents, musical interfaces designed for someone who was not necessarily a musician or who had little to no musical training, but was still able to express themselves musically with it. Using the skill sets and knowledge that they had, they were able to intuitively discover all of the different musical things that could result. These are extremely powerful tools for allowing non-musicians to be a part of this musical world which we are creating. Now, some of the obvious drawbacks of these techniques so far, they are few and far between. Oftentimes, they still require a caretaker or someone to produce them and put them together and to maintain the installation while the performer is experiencing it. And they're often cost prohibitive, and they're also quite often very Eurocentric experiences. For instance, Miki Delp's Gemini 6B, is designed for someone who has used an arcade machine before, or the Muse headband is designed for someone who is familiar with meditation. So these are by no means universal. They do often cast a much wider net than, say, sheet music, which is targeted only at trained musicians. With these different interfaces, we're able to target a much wider and more diverse population of people to be able to take part in these musical experiences that we are designing and building. So we are able to bring in more performers into the tent of new music. So with all of that, I would like to say thank you to a long list of people who you see here. And if you are interested in looking at any of the pieces, there will be links in the video following this. Thank you so much for listening to all of it. I hope you have a great rest of your day, and I hope you are now both informed about all of this different cool work that is going on, and fingers crossed, inspired to go add something of your own. Thanks so much.